Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. This week, I am not your host. Instead, Mickey Huff, the director of Project Censored, will be our guest host. This show is going to focus on how the 9/11 Commission and its report were sold to the world as the definitive account of 9/11. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest lies about 9/11 that we've been told. It is extremely important that people know about this very dangerous lie.
Hello, this is Mickey Huff. I am the director of Project Censored, a professor of history and social science at Diablo Valley College, and I am guest hosting this program today. We're going to be speaking about 9/11 issues, and my guest here is John Gold. He's been an advocate for 9/11 justice for over 12 years. He was a member of the steering committee for 911truth.org. He helped to found the site 911blogger.com. He's worked with different 9/11 family members over the years and received an honorary director award from the Feel Good Foundation for his work bringing attention to the environmental disaster that was 9/11, as well as for raising money for the sick and dying 9/11 first responders. John was a contributor to the complete 9/11 timeline, available at www.historycommons.org. He helped with the film 9/11 Press for Truth, worked alongside Gold Star mother and anti-war activist Cindy Sheehan for several years on different projects, including Camp Out Now, the Sizzlin' Summer Protests, and the Tour de Peace. John has been arrested 2 times for acts of civil disobedience, dedicating one arrest to 9/11 victim Robert McIlvaine Jr., and one to the Jersey Girls. He was the MC for the Treason in America conference in 2010, and he has written several articles over the years having to do with 9/11 and authored a book called 9/11 Truther, The Fight for Peace, Justice, and Accountability. He now hosts We Were Lied to About 9/11, and that's the program we're listening to right now. Welcome, John Gold.
Hi, Mickey. Thank you very much for being the guest host today.
It's my pleasure to guest host this kind of program, John. I've taught a course on 9/11 historiography for 10 years, and it's certainly an area of interest of mine, and there's so much that we are not told, certainly in the corporate media, about that. So the title of the show, We Were Lied to About 9/11, is probably an understatement. Let's get started, and tell us what the day of 9/11 was like for you, given that that's what sparked so much of your activism.
Well, let me see if I can put this into context for you. I wrote about this in my book. I shared my birthday with my grandfather, which is September 4th. I thought of myself as his 51st birthday present. Anyway, he passed away from pancreatic cancer the year prior to 9/11, right before my 29th birthday. He was the most important person in the world to me, and I can't understate that. So the next September, I had my second birthday without him, which made me incredibly sad. I would go to his gravestone on our birthday for years. Anyway, a few days after my second birthday without him, 9/11 happened. And I was already sad, and then that happened. My grandfather was a salesman, and I would often go to work with him. A lot of times we went to New York City together. Once or twice, I don't remember, he took me to Windows of the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center. So the towers were very sentimental to me. So anyway, what was the day of 9/11 like for me, after telling you that? I was at work, and I was working, and someone was listening to Howard Stern on the radio, and they were broadcasting it for everyone. And Howard had said that a plane had struck the tower, and I think he was making jokes about it because it was the first plane, and we didn't realize that we were under attack. And then the second plane hit, and everybody in the world knew we were under attack. So instantly I was just sitting at my desk, and I went to the news, CNN, to see what was going on. And I was reading about everything that was going on. And after the Pentagon was hit, I looked at my friend and I said, "Where the hell is our military?" And that was the first question that I ever asked about 9/11. But I didn't ask any more questions like that for a little while anyway. And the day, it was very traumatic. I left work. They let us go early, and I drove around for a couple of hours, and I was thinking about my grandfather, in the towers and the people that were dying, and I was very upset. And then I went home, and I was in my apartment, and they kept showing the towers falling over and over and over again. So I turned off the television and tried to watch a movie or two to get my mind off of things. And incidentally, one of the main reasons I ask this question of my guests is because most everyone I know can vividly remember, where they were that day and what they were doing. And many people in D.C., however, seemingly can't recall exactly what they were doing that day. So that's kind of a point I'm trying to drive through when I ask that question of people, aside from the fact that, everybody's story is interesting as to what they were doing that day. And that was it. It was a very heartbreaking day for me, and I was traumatized by it.
Indeed, and you mentioned the imagery, and I think that was seared into the minds of many Americans that day, and certainly people around the world. And on your show, We Were Lied To About 9/11, you've had a series of interviews with people: researcher Eric Larson, 9/11 family member, Jersey girl Lori Van Auken, the former New York Times reporter Phil Sheenon, his book The Commission: What We Didn't Know About 9/11. You've also interviewed NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, researcher Robbie Martin, Media Roots, and basically the thread here among all of these guests, stellar guests all, really question and seriously challenge the legitimacy of the 9/11 Commission and its overall report. And you've often said the 9/11 report was sold to the world as the definitive account of 9/11. It's the official historical narrative of 9/11 and what we're supposed to be thinking about this. Could you give us some accounts from the corporate media doing this? Can you give us some examples of how this is happening? And then we can go down and look at maybe some accounts from politicians as well.
Absolutely. Okay, I have a series of quotes that I've collected. The first one is, quote, "Among the Commission's charges is to write the definitive account of what actually transpired on that day and how it was able to happen," end quote. And that is from Thomas Keene from the second public hearing of the 9/11 Commission, which took place on May 6, 2003. Another quote, "The Independent Commission's mandate is to supply a definitive account of the government's handling of the terrorist plot that killed almost 3,000 people," end quote. That's from the New York Times, October 29th, 2003. Another one, quote, "They transcended partisan affiliation to work together for the people of this country. The result is not only a definitive account of what happened on September 11th, but also a thoughtful and compelling analysis of why it happened and where we must go from here." That wasn't the corporate media. That was actually Joe Lieberman, and that was September 7th, 2004. Another one, quote, "Full-page magazine ads last week billed The Path to 9/11 as that was a movie that was put forward by ABC, and it says, quote, that as based on the 9/11 Commission report, period. The message being peddled, this film would stay faithful to the definitive written account, with Commission co-chairman Thomas Keane on board to certify its authenticity. And that's from the Associated Press, September 14th, 2006. Basically, Thomas Keane was a consultant for that film, to give it the stamp of approval, supposedly, of the 9/11 Commission. This is a quote from Salon. Quote, "The 9/11 Commission report, the definitive account of the attacks and intelligence shortcomings that missed it," end quote. That's from Salon, June 13th, 2013. And the last one is from the description from Amazon of a book that James Ridgway wrote called The 5 Unanswered Questions About 9/11. And in that description it says, quote, "The 9/11 Commission report is widely declared to be the definitive account of the most devastating attack ever to take place on American soil, but in truth, the most vital questions about 9/11 have not been asked," end quote. So that's some from the corporate media talking about how the 9/11 Commission was the definitive account.
Well, it's certainly been planted that way. I mean, that means that we're not supposed to question this, right? And then you have a list also of, you mentioned Joe Lieberman. There are certainly other political figures.
Well, I have actually a little bit more from the corporate media that I wrote down. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with this. This next part is from my article entitled "The Facts Speak for Themselves," which has all of the sourcing within the article, and that's available at 911truthnews.com. Okay, the Washington Post reported that it is, quote, "a useful analysis of the changes that have taken place since, as well as the changes that have not taken place," end quote, and calling the Commission's unanimity and comprehensiveness, quote, "impressive," end quote. The Washington Post also reported that, quote, "the final report is a document of historic sweep and almost unprecedented detail, offering the sort of examination of a highly classified subject that customarily would not be possible for decades after the fact. From the findings of spy agencies to the tactics of fighter pilots, from the conversations of heads of state to the verbatim text of secret presidential briefings, this is the government laid bare," end quote. The New York Times reported that it was, quote, "uncommonly lucid, even riveting," end quote, and is a, quote, "improbable literary triumph," end quote. Time magazine said that the report was, quote, "meticulous in its reconstruction of the attacks and unflinching in its conclusions about why the government failed to stop them," end quote. Now, the 9/11 Commission report was actually nominated by the National Book Foundation in 2004 for Best in Nonfiction. So, just to let you know.
Yeah, we might category, but it's certainly another example, however, of how the official story is being buttressed from many in the corporate news media. So what about accounts from politicians? Do you have more?
Yes, I do.
Some other, yes.
Do you remember Catherine Harris?
Yes, yes. I don't know how we could forget Catherine Harris and her role in the 2000 election and so forth. Right.
She was the woman who suppressed the votes of, I think it was several thousand black people.
58,000 African Americans disenfranchised in the state of Florida alone, and Catherine Harris certainly helped that along. She was a Bush administration insider for sure, a Bush loyal, shall we say?
Right, and she referred to the 9/11 report as, quote, "one of the most important publications of our age," end quote. Senator Hillary Clinton said that the 9/11 Commission's report was, quote, "a great testimony to their willingness to search hard for the truth to get at the facts," end quote. Senator Charles Schumer said that the 9/11 Commission did a, quote, "incredible job." Now, in 2004, Bush's presidential campaign sent out something, and it said, quote, "The Commission's report makes the case for the policies that U.S. President Bush has been pursuing in the war on terror and eliminates any doubt that the best defense against the threat of global terror is a strong offense," end quote. And Bush said, quote, "I agree with their conclusion that the terrorists were able to exploit deep institutional failings in our nation's defenses that developed over more than a decade," end quote. So that's just some comments from politicians. At the end of this interview, I'm actually going to be playing a video clip of several other politicians saying several other things. So at the end of the interview, be sure to stay around and watch the clip.
How else is this being done, the buttressing of the official narrative? Maybe we can even turn a little bit. And is there anyone that actually that has questioned the 9/11 report's release in the corporate media? Was there anyone that was questioning the authenticity of the report after its release?
Okay. Well, before I get into that, really quickly, I'm just going to go over a different kind of praise that the 9/11 report received. And it came in the form of requests for what was called 9/11 type commissions for other horrible events in America's history, such as Katrina and the bailout crisis. I think it was John McCain who was saying we need to have a 9/11 type commission, further trying to lend credibility to the 9/11 Commission and its report, when in fact, as we all know, the 9/11 Commission was completely corrupt and compromised. All right, now, did anyone question the authenticity of the report when it was released? Well, the report was released on July 22nd, 2004, and there were New York Times and CBS polls questioning people about whether or not they believed what we were being told about 9/11. And apparently they started doing these polls in May 2002 and did a poll after the release of the 9/11 report. And that poll said that 24% said, quote, they were telling the truth. 56% said they are mostly telling the truth but hiding something. 16% said that they are, quote, mostly lying, end quote, and 4% were not sure. That was from the poll taken by New York Times and CBS. 911truth.org actually commissioned Zogby to conduct a poll in August 2004, and it found that, quote, 49.3% of New York City residents and 41% of New York citizens overall say that some U.S. leaders, quote, knew in advance that attacks were planned on or around 9/11/2001 and consciously failed to act, end quote. The Washington Post is the only major U.S. newspaper to mention the poll results and only mention them in an aside in a longer article. No New York newspapers mention the results of that poll at all. The biggest form of criticism, at least as far as I know, there was an article. Are you familiar with Harper's Magazine?
Of course, yes.
Okay, good. They wrote an article in October 2004, and it was called "Whitewash as Public Service."
Yes,
How the 9/11. You do remember that article?
Yes,
the further title was "How the 9/11 Commission Report Defrauds the Nation." Mm-hmm. That was the biggest critique that I was aware of, and that was the last one that I'm actually aware of at the time of the release of the report. But these reports, as I said, they didn't get any attention as compared to the praise that the 9/11 report received.
No, and that's a smattering of evidence you've just presented, and I can't help but bring this up. I do bring this up in my classes about the topic. Historian and political scientist Michael Parenti wrote a work called History as Mystery a number of years ago, and this is an apt quote from it. "Those engaged in the manufacturing of history often introduce distortions at the point of origin well before the history is written or even played out. This initial process of control is not usually left to chance, but is regularly pursued by interested parties who are situated to manipulate the record. And of course, the Bush administration was perfectly situated to manipulate the record. We know the long history of ignored warnings. We know that they dragged their feet for over 400 days on creating a commission and then cynically put Henry Kissinger in charge of it.
Right.
So there weren't many things they could have done worse, arguably. And they went kicking and screaming all the way into the commission. So, of course, they were going to control it with insiders, including, of course, Bush insider Philip Zelikow, who had amazing degree of oversight on what was happening with the commission report. So, again, it's this listing that you have of the definitive accounts as it's repeated over and over and over again. I remember a quote from George W. Bush at the time where he was talking in a press conference saying, "In my line of work, you've got to keep repeating things over and over again for the truth to sink in. You've got to catapult the propaganda." And they certainly catapulted the commission as great propaganda, as the so-called definitive account.
Well, it's not only the reports that I mentioned; it's the pundits that came after the reports that parroted the reports over and over again throughout the television and so on and so forth, to give people this idea that we had the most definitive account of 9/11 that we could possibly have. And it's funny, Lee Hamilton, when asked about the 9/11 Commission, he often says that it was their job to, quote, tell the story, end quote. And that's not true. The mandate of the 9/11 Commission was, quote, to give a full and complete accounting, end quote, of the 9/11 attacks. It wasn't to tell a story, but that's essentially what they did. They told the story.
And I know you've long wrote about and discussed the role of Philip Zelikow at the commission. Did you want to say anything about Zelikow's role?
Well, the thing about Philip Zelikow to me is that he belongs in jail, as far as I'm concerned, for the things that he did during the 9/11 Commission to prevent a real accounting from taking place. And I can't emphasize that enough. The man belongs in jail, along with a number of other people, as far as I'm concerned. And that's something we didn't see after 9/11. Nobody in government that was, I guess if you want to call them incompetent or criminally negligent or whatever you want to call it, nobody in government was held accountable. And in fact, people that should have been held accountable were instead rewarded and promoted. And just to give a really quick example of this is a recent story that just broke. There was a report from NBC News that just came out that talked about this individual who was responsible for misleading Congress on the effects of torture and how wonderful torture was and so on and so forth. This same individual lied before the 9/11 congressional inquiry about information about she supposedly took information about the hijackers to the FBI in person, but they have no record of that. And then she went on and said, "Oh, well, then I must have faxed it." So she lied before the 9/11 Commission. She was responsible for the lies regarding torture. She also decided to go watch KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, be waterboarded at the government's expense because she thought it would be cool. Anyway, NBC wrote a report about her and refused to say her name. And her name was Alfreda Francis Bukowski. And she was somebody who was promoted after 9/11, who should have been held accountable.
Well, it's amazing that's coming out this last couple of weeks, but that name had been around earlier. But again, the corporate media don't want to seem to report this. And by the way, as the rest of the country seemed to be caught up in the sort of the hoax hack from Sony Pictures, the interview, this is just one example of news and information that's going on that people could be paying attention to, other than these other propaganda distractions, and ones that do go back to the core of how we got to this ubiquitous surveillance state, a state of torture and permanent warfare. And again, 9/11 is a big gateway into this permanent war state. And I know that's also something that you have criticized, and certainly looking at the list of people you've interviewed here at We Were Lied to About 9/11, certainly Thomas Drake stands out as a whistleblower. Phil Sheehan's comments on the 9/11 Commission. Even you haven't interviewed John Farmer, but as an insider and a legal counsel to the 9/11 Commission, he said that the report was a whitewash.
I've actually sent out an interview request to him and never heard from him. So
yeah, it would be interesting to see his claims, although there certainly are differences among people like John Farmer and David Ray Griffin and Peter Dale Scott and others. It would definitely be interesting to have a discussion with John Farmer about his points, having that inside angle.
Right. And, well, he was he was part of the team on the 9/11 Commission that investigated NORAD, and I wanted to have a show to discuss NORAD's lies, and I figured, there'd be nobody more qualified, but I haven't heard from him.
His book is called The Ground Truth, so hopefully you could get in touch with him. It'll be good to hear that dialogue.
Right.
Okay, well, how about this then? Since we've been talking about the historical record and we've been talking about the great effort to control the so-called definitive account, what can be done at this point, do you think, to correct the historical record? I would argue getting these stories out to the public, having programs like this is a great way to do that. But let's hear from you, John Gold. What are some things that we should be doing, do you think, to correct the historical record? Who is working on such an endeavor, large and small?
Well, for years, Paul Thompson started the 9/11 timeline that was originally available at cooperativeresearch.org. It further moved on to historycommons.org. And that is a great tool for people to use, and it does correct much of the historical record, or at the very least, it shows, the contradictions to what we were told was the historical record. So the people at historycommons.org, they're currently working, they're always working on to fix the historical record. Another thing that could be done is there are teachers that develop syllabuses to teach 9/11 to their students. And what I've done over the years is I've tried to contact a lot of them to try and get them to tell the students that, we were lied to about 9/11, that we don't know the definitive account of 9/11. And unfortunately, I haven't had much success with that. I do have a report with regards to school curriculums that I'd like to read.
Yes.
This is from NewJersey.com, July 13th, 2011. Quote, a decade later, a detailed set of K-12 curriculum is being launched to give New Jersey educators tools for teaching about 9/11. Developed over 3 years and completed in time for the 10th anniversary of the attacks, the curriculum is called, quote, Learning from the Challenges of Our Time, Global Security, Terrorism, and 9/11 in the Classroom, end quote. The material includes lesson plans on teaching the events of that day itself, but also delves into topics ranging from the, quote, impact of hateful words, end quote, for elementary students to, quote, what is terrorism, end quote, in middle school, and, quote, reaction to and from the Muslim and Arab communities, end quote, for high school students. Also included are lessons on, quote, acts of kindness that occurred on 9/11 and ideas for students to help their town, community, and the world. Created by a volunteer group called the 4 Action Initiative, made up of families of September 11th, the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education and Liberty Science Center. The effort also included former Governor Thomas Keene and dozens of New Jersey teachers who wrote and piloted lesson plans. The curriculum is set to be introduced by representatives of the group and acting state education commissioner Christopher Surf at Liberty Science Center on Thursday, end quote. So basically what I was reading that for was to again show, Thomas Keene's involved, to put the official stamp of approval. Thomas Keene, who was the commissioner of the 9/11 Commission. So whenever he puts his name to something, it supposedly lends credibility to something about 9/11, but in my mind, it just destroys the credibility.
Yeah, and again, having taught a course on 9/11 issues, I also teach modern U.S. history, and I tell my students, it's very interesting, I tell them to look in the last chapter of the course textbook, and I've used Howard Zinn's text, I've used Eric Foner's text, I've used several different texts in class, but I tell them to go to the final chapter and look at what is being said about 9/11, and particularly with something like the Foner work, which is a pretty progressive historical narrative, Give Me Liberty, it's called. Again, it basically kowtows to the definitive account that you and I have been discussing, and it's really kind of disappointing, but it's a great opportunity and example to show students that, hey, we should be focusing on the construction of these historical narratives and how they work themselves into the books and work themselves into the consciousness of the nation and of people here, because it's very hard to undo these kinds of things that are repeated over and over again.
Absolutely right. And it's actually one of the things that scares me is how are kids being taught about 9/11? There are many kids who were, 5, 6 years old when 9/11 happened and have no idea about the history of things. And, they could grow up thinking that this is a normal world that we're living in, this post-9/11 world where we preemptively invade countries, where we lose our civil liberties, where all these horrible things happen. And I don't want children growing up thinking this is normal. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do know what you mean, because I'm teaching a lot of people that were that old when 9/11 took place, and when I'm going back and showing the creation of this so-called definitive account and all the holes and problems in it, as well as historical problems with commissions in general, you definitely get the sideways glance. You get a lot of folks shaking their heads in disbelief, and that's why I use so many varied sources, is to say, hey, don't take my word for it, but how much have you actually investigated? What have you actually read? What have you actually seen? And most of them, of course, have only seen the corporate media accounts, political accounts, just like the listing that you gave off earlier here in our discussion. And so when I get them to believe, to realize that they really haven't looked into it much at all and they've accepted a lot of it on faith, then they go back and start looking, and then they actually also then come to a position of questioning. And at least for me as an educator, that's one of the things that I think that I do about moving this issue forward, is getting people to question these accounts and question what they're told, so that it may lead them to their own process of discovery.
Right, exactly. And it's unfortunate. I've spoken to kids who go to school, and they tell me that all they're taught about is the day of 9/11. There's no context given. There's no question about the 9/11 report. And it's scary to me. I don't want them growing up thinking they know the truth when in fact they don't. And so that's scary, and it's important to me, for them anyway, to know the historical record.
Yeah, I know that that's certainly something that you're doing with the program, is, again, really trying to set the record straight. And, again, I can't agree more with that fact that someone, as an educator, that's really what I've tried to do with the subject of 9/11. And some of the interviews that have been done on this program have been useful in class for students to listen to and encounter these people. So, again, I think that it's a nice service to be providing to people, that you can show these counter narratives to official accounts that may lead people to questioning and being active participants in how they're informed and how their own views are shaped about the world, rather than passive spectators or observers. And I think that anything we can do to encourage critical and independent thought is a step in the right direction. John Gold, is there anything else you'd like to add today to the end of our discussion?
Sure. I again want to thank you for being the guest host today. I didn't honestly know anybody who was I've tried to have the experts on, so, to have the best of the best on the show, and I honestly didn't know anybody who knew more about this particular topic than I did, so I was the expert today. It was funny.
That's fine.
Somebody told me that I could have written the questions out and given the answers to someone else to to have this interview. And somebody, my friend Scott Ford, said that would have been the Milli Vanilli effect, creating an expert. But
it's been my pleasure to have a discussion with you. I've long been familiar with the work that you've done and the activism you've been engaged in around 9/11, and it's been my pleasure to have you take the platform and share with people all that you know. And I think it also helps give people that listen to your show, We Were Lied to About 9/11, a little more insight on who you are and where you're coming from. And I think that's very important for listeners as well.
Well, thank you very much, Mickey. And I also want to promote Project Censored, of which you are the director.
Thanks so much, right? Listeners can go and learn more at projectcensored.org. And, of course, we have our own radio show where you've been on there as well, the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. And definitely, John, keep up the good work, and thanks again for everything that you're doing. I believe you also now are going to have some additional clips for people, so please stick around and check out these examples of things that we were talking about on today's show.
Thank you very much, Mickey, for your time today.
My pleasure, John.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
We were very impressed by the fact that the commission report came out unanimously, that it was a real service to our country, and that it will be available to the public. So I know I speak for all of my colleagues when I salute the commission for its excellent work, for its leadership, its patriotism, and its service to our country by being so thoughtful and putting forth such a useful document.
We are very grateful to Governor Kane and to Congressman Hamilton for their leadership of this critically important commission. This commission's report, I think, will be very important and useful and helpful.
I'm proud of Governor Kane and his work, and as a former colleague of Lee Hamilton on the International Relations Committee, I'm proud of their collective work and their ability to bring a commission report that is unanimous in its vote.
And what we hope will come from this report is not only some sense of closure to those families who lost loved ones on 9/11, but enable this Congress to regain the sense of urgency that we need to protect this country. It was a bipartisan report. It was one that should be read carefully and listened to. And if you read the findings that will be within the pages of that document, you're going to find that we need to move even faster. We need to be even stronger in protecting this country against terrorists than we are today. And that's what I hope is accomplished by the release of this report.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say, read this report. It shows that we're at war with an implacable and a very dangerous enemy. It's an extremely important contribution to our understanding of what happened in the days leading up to the tragic events of September 11th.
Reading that report shows the kinds of things we need to do as we move forward.
This report, the 9/11 Commission report, comes at a very propitious time. We are poised not only to continue the reforms that have already been undertaken in both the executive and legislative branches since September 11, 2001, but also to enact new reforms. And there's much in this volume that we can study and infer lessons from.
Thank you. The release of today of the 9/11 Commission report provides America another opportunity to assess our progress in the war on terror for over the last 3 years.
I think this is an extremely important contribution to the debate in America today. And this is a very readable document. It puts a face on how terrorists operate. and what goes on in their deranged minds and why they are going to do the things they can do and how they can do them. It educates us, and people should read this and understand. And we're taking this seriously. Actually, we're ahead of the curve on some of the recommendations here, which is the good news, and we will follow through on some of the other recommendations and give them close consideration.
Joe and I and Arlen Specter and Evan Bayh are here to thank the 9/11 Commission for the magnificent job that they did. Let me just speak very briefly. This commission has issued in a bipartisan fashion, which is critical, a report which I think is the blueprint for future reforming of government, both in the executive branch and in Congress.
Tom Kean, Lee Hamilton, and the other members of this commission who have issued this report have more than met the challenge that we gave them. They have exceeded our highest expectations. They have answered the questions that the families, we, and all of America wanted answered. How could this have happened, and what could we do to make sure it never happens again? This is a straight-talking, tough, bold, non-partisan report. And Tom and Lee and the other members of the commission have done extraordinary service to their nation in bringing it forward.
I also hope that this book will outsell President Clinton's book as well. I don't know if you're getting 12 million or not, but I certainly hope so. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much.